In 1963, a man in central Turkey lost his chickens. They kept slipping through a crack at the back of his cellar and never coming back. When he finally knocked the wall open to look for them, the crack turned into a passage. The passage turned into a stairway. The stairway went down into the dark, past one carved room, then another, then another. Beneath his ordinary house in the town of Derinkuyu sat a city cut straight down into solid rock, as deep as an 18-story building driven into the earth instead of into the sky. Roughly 85 meters below the surface. Room enough for 20,000 people and all their animals. It had stables and kitchens, wine presses and wells, chapels, and air that still moved through shafts no wider than a forearm. Engineers measured it later and could not fully explain how the air kept circulating to the lowest level without a single machine. Who carves a city that deep into solid rock? And what were they so afraid of that the ground itself looked safer than the daylight? This is the story of Derinkuyu, who built it, how it worked, and how an entire population learned to vanish beneath their own farms when the armies came. This story does not begin with an army. It begins with the rock. Derinkuyu sits in Cappadocia, a region in the middle of what is now Turkey, on a high plateau about 1,300 meters above sea level. Millions of years ago, the volcanoes here buried the whole landscape in ash. That ash compressed into a stone called tuff, and tuff has one strange property that decided everything that happened next. When it sits underground, it is soft enough to carve with a hand tool, almost like hard cheese. But once it is exposed to air, it hardens. A wall you cut on Monday is rock by the following month. For the people living on this plateau, that was the gift hiding in the ground beneath them. They could dig downward with simple iron tools, and the deeper they went, the more solid the city became around them. But the rock alone does not explain why they bothered. Plenty of cultures sat on soft stone and never tunneled into it. The reason the people of Cappadocia went down is that above ground they had nowhere to hide. Look at where this plateau sits. It is open country, flat and exposed, with no mountain ranges to disappear into and no coastline to guard. For thousands of years it was a corridor, a place armies marched through on their way to somewhere richer. Hittites, Persians, Greeks, Romans, and later the armies of the early Islamic conquests all moved across this ground. A farming family standing in an open field could see a column of riders coming from miles away, and there was nothing between them and the horizon. They could not build a wall high enough. They could not field an army of their own. Therefore they did the one thing the rock allowed. They reversed the logic of a fortress. Instead of building up, where any attacker could see you and besiege you, they built down, where an attacker could not even find you. That choice created a new problem, and then another, and then another. Solving them, one at a time, is what turned a few hidden cellars into a city for 20,000. The first problem was the most basic. How do you hollow out 18 levels of rock without the whole thing falling on your head? The answer is that they never carved a single open void. They left the stone itself doing the work. Walk through Derinkuyu today, and you move through a web of narrow corridors and modest chambers. Never a cathedral-sized hall, because the builders understood that solid pillars and tight rooms hold up the weight above them. They cut the rooms small and the columns thick, and they let the tuff carry its own load. The proof is the simplest fact about the site. In all the centuries it has existed, through earthquakes that flattened towns on the surface, not one floor of Derinkuyu has ever collapsed. With the structure solved, they could keep digging, but the deeper they went, the harder the next problem became, because 85 meters of rock above your head does something a farmhouse never has to worry about. It cuts off the air. A few people can breathe in a sealed cellar for a while. 20,000 people, plus their cattle, plus their cooking fires, would suffocate in hours. The builders knew it, and they solved it with the feature that still impresses engineers more than anything else down there. They cut ventilation shafts, more than 50 of them, narrow vertical chimneys bored straight up through the rock to the surface, some reaching down more than 50 meters. The shafts pulled fresh air down and let stale air and smoke rise out, and they were placed so carefully that air reached all the way to the deepest occupied level. There were no fans, no bellows, no moving parts of any kind. Just holes in the rock, angled and sized by people working with hand tools and oil lamps, doing by instinct and trial what a modern building now does with a mechanical system and a steady supply of power. The result kept tens of thousands of people, plus their animals and their cooking fires, breathing comfortably under 85 meters of stone, and it has gone on working, untouched, for more than 1,000 years. That solved breathing. But a city sealed against an army has to survive a siege, and a siege is really a contest over one thing: time. Specifically, who runs out of water first. Here the builders thought several moves ahead of their enemies. They dug wells, but they dug them in a very particular way. The wells reached down to the water table from inside the city, and critically, many of them never opened to the surface at all. An attacker standing in the empty town above had no way to find the water source and no way to poison it. The people below could draw clean water for as long as they needed, while the army on the surface had no idea where it was even coming from. There is a strange afterlife to that detail. For centuries after the city was abandoned and forgotten, the local townspeople of Derinkuyu drew their drinking water from one of those old shafts. They had no idea their buckets were dropping past the ceilings of a hidden city on the way down to the water. The Turkish name they gave the town says it plainly. Derinkuyu means deep well. The city could now stand without collapsing, breathe without machines, and drink without exposing itself. Which brings us to the moment everything was built for, the day the lookout saw riders on the horizon. Picture the surface settlement on an ordinary morning. Houses, fields, animals, smoke from cooking fires. Then a warning comes down from the high ground that a raiding party is approaching, and the whole plan that took generations to carve into the rock executes in a matter of minutes. The people go down, not a handful of them, the whole population, with their children, their food stores, and as much livestock as they can drive into the entrances. They descend level by level into the dark, and behind them, at the choke points, they begin to close the doors. The doors are the part everyone remembers. They are not wooden gates. They are great circular slabs of stone, carved like enormous millstones, some weighing close to 1/2 ton. Each one sits in a carved track beside a passage, and when danger comes, it is rolled across the corridor to seal it. Most of them have a round hole bored straight through the centre, and there is still debate about what it was for, whether to see through, to drive a spear through at anyone on the far side, or to work a beam from within. The key detail is the geometry. These stones could only be moved from the inside. A defender could roll one shut and brace it, but an attacker standing in the corridor had nothing to grip and no leverage to push it back. And the city did not rely on one of them. Each level could be sealed off on its own, so that even if a door somewhere was forced, the people simply withdrew deeper and closed the next one. The corridors did the rest of the work. The passages between levels were cut deliberately low and narrow, so narrow that a person has to stoop and move in single file. An armoured raider could not charge through. He could only crawl, one man at a time, into a dark tunnel he did not know, toward a stone door he could not open, while the people on the other side waited with every advantage. One defender at a tight passage could hold off a crowd, because only one attacker could reach him at a time, and that attacker arrived bent double and half blind. Now stand where the raiders stood. They come over the ridge expecting a soft target. a farming village to burn and loot. They reach it and find houses still warm and completely empty. No people, no animals, and the food is already gone. There is a hole in the ground that seems to lead nowhere, sealed somewhere below by a stone they cannot move. They can burn the empty houses. They can sit and wait. But waiting costs them the one thing a raiding party never has, which is time, while below their feet 20,000 people sit in cool, ventilated rooms with clean water and weeks of food, listening to the boots on the ceiling and waiting them out. Every hour the raiders linger is an hour they are not raiding somewhere easier, and eventually the arithmetic forces them back onto their horses with nothing. The math never favoured the attacker, and as far as the record shows, that is exactly how it played out. Cappadocia was raided again and again over the centuries, and the underground cities kept doing their job. Which raises the question the whole story turns on. Who exactly were they hiding from for so long that they kept expanding a city 85 meters into the earth? The beginning is genuinely uncertain, and honest archaeology admits it. The most widely accepted view is that the first levels were cut by the Phrygians, an Iron Age people, somewhere around the 8th or 7th century before Christ. Some researchers argue the very earliest galleries could be older still, going back to the Hittites. What is not in doubt is who turned the shelter into the vast complex we can walk through today, and when. That work belongs to the medieval centuries and to a specific group of people. As Christianity spread through the region under Roman and then Byzantine rule, Greek-speaking Christian communities took the older tunnels and drove them deeper, wider, and far more elaborate. They added the chapels, they added the rooms that looked like halls and schools, and they did it because they had a reason that came back generation after generation. From the 7th and 8th centuries onward, this frontier became a war zone between the Byzantine Empire and the advancing armies of the early Islamic caliphates. Raiding columns swept across the Anatolian plateau in the campaigning season almost every year, and the farming Christians who lived there faced the same problem their ancestors had faced under the Hittites and the Persians. An open landscape, a stronger enemy, and no army of their own. Therefore they did what the Rock had always allowed. They went down and they made the city bigger. This was the period that turned a shelter into the place we can walk through now. The chapels carved into the stone, the larger halls, the level after level of living space, all of it traces back to communities that expected the raiders to return and built accordingly. They were not improvising in a crisis. They were maintaining a permanent insurance policy against an enemy they knew would keep coming. This was not a one-time emergency. It was a way of life that lasted for centuries. The threat changed faces over time, from Arab raiders to, much later, the Mongol armies that tore through the region in the 14th century under Timur. Through all of it, the underground cities of Cappadocia kept absorbing whole populations and handing them back alive when the danger passed. And Derinkuyu was not alone. It was the largest, but the plateau is honeycombed with these places. Archaeologists have catalogued more than 200 underground settlements across the region. Derinkuyu, the deepest of them, was connected to its neighbour Kaymakli by a tunnel believed to run for several kilometres, so that people could move between two underground cities without ever surfacing into the open air where an enemy was waiting. The rooms themselves tell you these were not panic shelters where people crouched for an afternoon. They tell you people lived down here, sometimes for months. There are stables with rings carved into the rock for tethering animals. There are communal kitchens with blackened ceilings from generations of cooking smoke. There are presses for wine and for oil, deep storage rooms for grain, and cellars cool enough to keep food through a long siege. On the second level, there is a wide room with a vaulted ceiling, unusual for the site, that researchers believe served as a religious school, with smaller study rooms opening off it. There are chapels cut into the stone, and there are graves. People were born, taught, fed, and buried in this city without seeing the sun. That is the difference between a hiding place and a city. A hiding place buys you an afternoon. Derinkuyu was built to let an entire community pause its life underground and resume it later, intact, as if the war above had simply been waited out, which again and again it was. If Derinkuyu solved the problem of survival so completely, the obvious question is why anyone ever stopped using it. The answer is not that the city failed. It is that the world above it slowly changed until the city was no longer needed. As the region settled under stable Ottoman rule and large-scale raiding faded, the daily threat that justified an underground life receded. The Christian communities who had carved and maintained the place still used the tunnels in hard times, and there are accounts of them sheltering there as late as the early 20th century. But the constant need was gone, and a city is only maintained as long as people depend on it. The final break came in 1923. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Greece and Turkey carried out a forced population exchange, and the Greek-speaking Christians of Cappadocia, the very people whose ancestors had built and kept Derinkuyu for over 1,000 years, were uprooted and sent to Greece. They left, and they took the knowledge of the place with them. The entrances were sealed or simply forgotten. New families moved into the houses above, lived their lives on the surface, and drew their water from a strange deep well without ever asking what their buckets were passing on the way down. The greatest underground city of the ancient world sat directly beneath an ordinary Turkish town, silent and complete, for the better part of 40 years, until a man went looking for his chickens. When that wall came down in 1963 and the passages opened up, archaeologists realized almost immediately what they were standing in. They began mapping it level by level, descending past 40 meters, then deeper still. To this day, only about 8 of Derinkuyu's levels are open to the public. The rest run further down than the tourist route goes, and researchers still argue about exactly how far the lowest galleries reach. Today you can walk it yourself. Derinkuyu is part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and visitors descend the same narrow stooping passages the builders cut, past the great rolling doors still sitting in their tracks, past the stables and the wine presses and the vaulted school, while air moves quietly through shafts that have been doing their job for more than 1,000 years. The engineers who study the ventilation still come away impressed because the thing works, and it was built by people with hand tools, oil lamps, and an understanding of their own rock that we are still trying to fully reconstruct. The man who found it was not looking for the largest underground city ever discovered. He was looking for his chickens. The city had been there the whole time, directly under the floor he stood on, exactly where its builders left it, waiting in the dark, the way it had always waited for whoever finally came down the stairs. We dig up forgotten knowledge the modern world walked away from. What buried structure should we investigate next? Subscribe, and let's keep digging.